global capitalism, then, we recognize that since it is the only paradigm, global capitalism, as we saw in the last few minutes of the last section, was responsible for the redistribution of wealth between the developed ED countries and the developing countries, and that the attempt to reappropriate the jobs back to the first world is absolutely ridiculous. It's never going to happen. And I would argue that it probably shouldn't happen. We should change the way in which we understand employment. The supply as jobs should change. Well, since there's only one economic paradigm that governs the entirety of the world, then that becomes a very monolithic, very powerful institution of generating wealth. Right? Since global capitalism doesn't have an ancillary economic paradigm, there is no other economic paradigm out there. And I do encourage social scientists, especially young scholars, don't look at this as like, oh, there's nothing that you could ever conceptualize beyond capitalism. No, there might be a new way to make sense of generation of economic wealth that has a lot less of the exploitation, quote unquote, that's inherently built into the system. Or, since Marx might be right and we might be grinding the gears to an end in the next 100 years or so to capitalism, maybe we can come up with a conceptually different economic paradigm. All of that is conjecture, though, because there is no other economic paradigm. The only economic paradigm that exists in the entire world is global capitalism. Thus, there is an increasingly high propensity for human rights violations to fall and to unfold as a consequence of that paradigm, where political variations might be in place, and human rights abuses might vary with respect to what political ideology is set by a sovereign nation. There is only one economic paradigm, and that paradigm is global capitalism. As I said, I don't want to be biased in this account. It is a human rights lecture, so I will be taking the voice, assuming the voice of those who are being attacked, but I will also sort of give the antithetical account that it's not all boogeyman, that there is a lot of good and a lot of justice that unfolds as a rise of global capitalism. One, because I believe it, and two, because it's my obligation as an academic. So I apologize for that sort of very long opening statement, if you will, but you need that in order to understand what it is that we're about to do, because it's about to get really deep really quick. Okay, so now we begin. The bottom of page 5, let me read this quote. Globalization, where's this quote from? Malcolm Waters, the book is Globalization, page 3. Quote, globalization is a social process in which the constraints of geography on social and cultural arrangements proceed in which people become increasingly aware that they, social and cultural arrangements, are receding. What does that mean? Insofar as we talk about the rise of globalization, we recognize that it affects people within their sort of geographic borders. It affects communities of people. And it affects the way in which their socio-cultural arrangements recede. I am not as socially connected. I am not as culturally connected because there is an outside threat. This outside threat is understood in terms of globalization. Globalization is specifically threatening my social arrangements, my cultural arrangements through all the processes, all the steps that we'll talk about, including environmental degradation and so on. But I don't want to jump ahead. Conceptually, what does that look like, right? There's a sense in which then we have to you would have to think of globalization as globalization increases, our social arrangements recede, right? On social and cultural arrangements proceed in which people become increasingly aware that they, our social and cultural arrangements, are receding, right? So there's an inverse relationship. As globalization rises, as the growth of globalization extends deeper and deeper into the developing world, the third world, I hate that word, then our social and our cultural arrangements recede. So roughly, conceptually, it would look something like this, right? It would look something like this. This would be, how would that be? It would be globalization here, Globalization. Globalization or global capitalism, right? As global capitalism is increasing, as it increases, there is a recession, right? Not economic recession, obviously, but there's a recession in social and cultural, social and cultural arrangements, right? So socio-cultural arrangements recede. So as it recedes, globalization increases, and you would have something like this, right? As we move up, as it increases, unfortunately, our socio-cultural arrangements recede. So you have a graph that looks something like that, right? Which you could argue, the increase of global capitalism comes as a consequence of the recession in socio-cultural arrangements. Now, obviously, you would have to qualify what exactly does he mean by socio-cultural arrangements. What does that mean? How is it bad? Da, 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 da. I'm not going to get into that now, but this is conceptually what we're talking about. As globalization increases, socio-cultural arrangements decrease as a consequence of this, right? Now, just to be fair, the response might be, no, it's not that, right? As globalization increases, right, our socio-cultural arrangements also increase, right? Globalization is good for the world, might be a response. And then you might have more of a matrices of dots, right? The argument is, listen, jobs have been outsourced from the developed world to the developing world, and it might look as though it's worse for the United States and the developed world since there aren't as many jobs here, but it's been a boon for the developing world, right? Middle class is growing rapidly in the developing world. China's middle class is getting a lot bigger. India's middle class is getting a lot bigger. China's population is huge. So imagine what that middle class is going to look like, right? Once it fully realizes itself. It's going to be an enormous, enormous middle class, right? So as the middle classes exchange, it's been a transference, right? It's been a redistribution of wealth to the developing world, which has resulted in a greater standard of living for more people in the globe. That's just what it is. So that the attempt to say that global capitalism is inherently bad assumes that we're talking about one specific region, for example, the developed world. But if you look at the rise of global capitalism, I'm trying to give an antithetical account, right? Whether I believe this or not is not important. I'm just trying to give both sides of the argument so you can see what's going on. An antithetical account is, globally speaking, global capitalism has been the best thing since sliced bread, because now more people in the developing world have an opportunity, and as I said in the last section, as the Eye of Sauron, right, as the global capitalism looks for the largest workforce that will work for the least amount of money and finds it. Yeah, you can interpret that as exploitation. Yeah, you can say it's bad. Yeah, you can situate it in terms of its pejorative sense. It's easy to do that. But what you never hear theorists usually do is to be fair and to say that that middle class now is elevated. That the vast majority of people who would never have opportunities, where the likelihood of death and sickness and illness from diseases, we'll talk about this later, is at its highest levels globally, now have a nice, thick, regified middle class, right? So that globally it's better, right? And I'm not here to say who's right, right? But I want to give you, again, as I said, this section of the lecture is going to be a little heady, but hopefully I'm not going too fast, and hopefully that makes sense. So that's the first quote. Next quote on page 5, globalization is the final assault of capitalism in all those areas of the world that previously escaped it, right? So that, actually I just quoted it, but I actually can use this. Globalization is the final assault. Obviously, the idea is systematically being situated that globalism is pejorative. It's a bad thing. I'm using the term globalism negatively. But I'm just giving you an example which really challenges that assumption that globalization is the bad thing. But the idea is that here is the world and globalization is expanding. right? So that it gobbles up the last remaining